taller than you are, Anita.
Catch the hose.
Alright. Yeah. Alright, sweet. Okay, good.
Okay, so could you just introduce yourself first and then tell us how much you know about phosphorus or something
Okay.
like that?
Okay, so it's Dr. Susan Gressens, and been a professor at Towson for 20 years now. My specialty is in aquatic ecology, freshwater ecology, and looking at the interactions between dissolved nutrients, algae, and grazing invertebrates, mostly in streams, but since I've come to Maryland, I've been learning a lot more about the Chesapeake Bay, working with local water monitoring groups.
Okay. So how do you feel about chicken farming in Maryland?
Well, there's an awful lot. I support farmers, but I think we have a few too many chickens on the Eastern Shore, considering the state of the bay. And Marylanders really like to eat cheap chicken. So somewhat ambivalent, but as a vegetarian, it's like, well, why not eat less chicken?
Truth. What should be the appropriate amount of waste generated/used as fertilizer?
Okay, so the idea is you've got the chicken sheds with 100,000 chickens in them, and obviously there's a lot of chicken waste and bedding, and given that chickens are warm-blooded and they eat a lot of grain, they don't use all the phosphorus, so it builds up in the bedding, and there's obviously a volume of this, and it makes sense, to recycle that and put it on the fields. This is where we get into the phosphorus chemistry a little bit, something I've worked on in terms of looking at how the actual phosphate molecule tends to stick to soils, especially clays and things, of which there's not as much clay on the Eastern Shore, but in farm fields, normally phosphorus would escape if it's sticking to soil particles that washed off in the rainfall, so you definitely have to be careful to prevent erosion. And soils have a tendency to absorb phosphate molecules to their surface and hang on to them, except for certain circumstances. But the soils have kind of like a chemical sponge capacity. So they can absorb and absorb, but given the particular kind of soils, eventually the particles of the tiny soils will eventually get saturated with phosphorus, in which case they can't hold anymore, and then if you put more on, if it's in a condition where it can dissolve in soil moisture, if the soils run out of oxygen, if they're very soggy, depending on some of the chemicals in the soils, once the soils become saturated, then the phosphate could actually trickle through in the groundwater and get out into the bay. And I suspect that is something that soil scientists on the Eastern Shore are very active studying and trying to find out. So stepping back from that, what's the optimal amount of phosphorus to grow crops versus what's the maximum amount that the soil could actually hold before it starts leaking back out again? And that's really going to have to be determined on a farm-by-farm basis. After spending time on sabbatical in the upper Midwest in Minnesota, you learn that agriculture is a big business up there also, and you realize they have lots of legislation about, farmers are required to get their soils tested to find out how much more fertilizer do you put on them. But when you're talking about the cornfields out there, you actually have to pay for the fertilizer. So it's like actually a good thing if you put less on. But the problem with the Eastern Shore is now we have an excess of material that could, and what do you do with it given the volume? So how much you put on, that's a technical question that each farmer is going to have their soil tested and figure out what it can hold.